Good evening, everyone. My name is Ken McCormack, and on behalf of everyone that presented tonight, I'd just like to thank you guys for showing your support and coming out tonight. My project focuses on some work I've been doing as an intern for the past year with the Southern Arizona Buffelgrass Coordination Center, focusing on a project that uses a Python tool for ArcGIS that investigates the response time and rate of spread behavior for brush fires in Tucson's urban washes and vacant lots. Before jumping into the discussion of my project, I'd like to first define for you what a brush fire is. A brush fire is any fire occurring within a vegetated area with grasses no taller than 3 feet high. And to illustrate for you the history of brush fires in Tucson, between 2000 and 2014, Tucson's experienced 17,666 brush fires. You can see from here that that number has stayed below 1,000 per year every single year since 2009. Yet it's a surprisingly high number for the Sonoran Desert. And to break this down one step further, we can see that 31% of all these brush fires have occurred within the driest months of the year of April, May, and June. And taking it even further, we see that 30% also occur between the hours of 3 and 7 p.m. Now that you're familiar with how the regularity of brush fires is in Tucson, I'd like to now address how my project investigates this issue. The purpose of my project was to create a scenario-based tool in Python for ArcGIS that allows users to prepare and plan for brush fires in the wildland-urban interface. The wildland-urban interface is where natural vegetation intersects urban development. Tucson is becoming increasingly more and more a part of the wildland-urban interface as Buffelgrass continues to encroach further and further into the city. The danger here is that in the natural environment, brush fires spread very quickly among grasslands, but the fuels making up those fires are mostly cellulose, lignin, and other plant components. When those fire spreads reach residential communities, those fuels now include structures such as houses. This is a map that was provided by the University of Wisconsin's Silvis Laboratory that maps out the wildland-urban interface and wildland-urban intermix areas of Arizona. Zooming into Tucson, we see what areas belong to the wildland-urban interface and intermix areas. The wildland-urban intermix are these red areas, and these are areas where there's greater than 6 housing units per square kilometer within a distance of 2.4 kilometers of vegetation covering more than 50% of the area. Whereas the wildland-urban interface areas in yellow are areas where there's also greater than 6 housing units per square kilometer within a distance of 2.4 kilometers of vegetation covering less than 50% of that area. In 2003, it was estimated that approximately 42 million homes reside within the wildland-urban interface. To give some context to that number, between 2000 and 2011, wildland insured losses totaled $7.9 billion. And the significance here is that that number is $6.2 billion greater than the previous decades, perhaps hinting that brush fires are becoming more common, more severe, or both. This is a map from that same study at the University of Wisconsin that shows the number of structures burned per wildfire across the country between the years of 1999 and 2011. When we compare the symbol shown for Tucson down here with that of the map legend, we see that between 101 and 2,820 structures are burned per fire in Tucson between this time period. My project focuses entirely on Tucson's urban washes and vacant lots. And I chose these areas because vacant lots are likely to receive less vegetation monitoring than parks, neighborhoods, and even along major roadways. Likewise, urban washes are known to be densely populated with buffelgrass, as well as for having 7,531 brush fires occurring within a distance of 263 feet of a wash since the year 2000. Here I've mapped out those brush fires as these blue points, and the washes are shown by the light blue lines. For those of you less familiar with buffelgrass, it's an invasive plant that was brought to Tucson by the Soil Conservation Service in 1938 as a way to feed cattle and control erosion. Natural vegetation in the Sonoran Desert has a very low tolerance for fire, yet buffelgrass loves fire. And that's because after a burn, it's reduced to a tiny stem with nodes allowing it to regenerate leaves and disperse seeds more quickly than the neighboring native plants. The first task I faced when performing my analysis was I wanted to figure out where was the highest concentration of brush fires in Tucson located. And to answer that question, I added point data for brush fires that occurred between the years 2000 and 2014. I added this to ArcMap, and I used the spatial analyst tool kernel density to create this map. And what I found was that I had 3 primary hotspots, here, here, and here. And what's going on in these locations is there's between 468 and 584 brush fires per square mile. The next step, I took each of these 3 hotspots and I digitized the polygon around each one. I then added the washes layer, again shown by this light blue line, and I buffered that by 263 feet because from the earlier map, I know that I have more than 7,500 brush fires occurring within this distance of a wash during this time frame. I then added 100 random points to each of the 3 hotspots, and these random points would act as brush fire scenarios that will be run in the Brushfire tool. Here I've symbolized those scenarios occurring in vacant lots as these light blue points, and those occurring in washes as the dark blue points. The next step is to calculate a rate of spread of the fire. To do this, I use a fire modeling program called BehavePlus, which calculates the rate of spread using very few variables, as well as it doesn't have a spatial component. The reason I didn't choose a program with a spatial component is because most asked for a vegetation layer, which I didn't have available. So in that regard, BehavePlus worked very well. If you look at the fuel model parameter, I have listed a GR3. And that's because a few years back, Perry Grissom, the fire ecologist at Saguaro National Park, conducted a study where he compared the fuel loads for Buffelgrass, brushfire fuel loads to Scott and Bergen's updated fuel model types. And what he concluded was that the GR3 and the GR4 fuel models are most related to those of Buffelgrass. So based on his conclusions for this project, I use only a GR3 or a GR4 fuel model. These fuel moisture content values were derived from the Scott and Bergen paper and pertain to the GR3 fuel model. From looking at data collected by NOAA over the past 50 years, I was able to calculate an average wind speed per year in Tucson of 8 miles per hour. Together, all these values create a rate of spread of 0.22 feet per minute. In the natural environment, brush fires spread with an elliptical shape, as shown by these control burns in the background of this slide. This diagram was a template that was used in Python to generate the fire spreads. And the way the tool works is, for example, if a fire is occurring within a wash, the tool dissolves all the segments of that wash and then splits the line at where the fire is occurring. It then uses an algorithm to determine the direction, the width, and the length of that fire spread. Before I show you some of these fire spread outputs, I'd like to briefly go over some assumptions that were made for this analysis. The first assumption is that all vacant lots and washes had a slope of 0 degrees. And that's because, in general, these areas are relatively flat. The second assumption was that traffic and intersection delays will not influence the response time for firefighters going from the station to the brush fire. The third assumption, as I mentioned earlier, was that all scenarios described either a GR3 or a GR4 fuel model. The fourth and final assumption was that brush fires will not travel over a hard surface or spread beyond the wash boundaries. And to give you an idea of this, I've used this example. So this is what the outputs of the brush fire tool look like. Here I have a fire beginning at this red ignition point, and it's spreading a measured distance each minute to every single one of these green distance points. Clearly, this building is at risk of being damaged from the fire, yet it's unlikely that the fire will spread over or through the building. This demonstrates how it's the user's responsibility to verify that the outputs are logical. Since no vegetation layer was available to clip these outputs to, I instead used the county's parcels layer. So this demonstrates a more likely scenario. Here the fire spread is being clipped to the parcels layer and it's not traveling across the street. I ran 300 brush fire scenarios, so if you remember, I had 3 primary hotspots, each having 100 random points that acted as brush fire scenarios. I ran all these at once by turning the Python script into a batch, and what I found was that on average, an area of 1.85 square feet was burned per minute in vacant lots versus an area of 0.05 square feet per minute in washes. And to give you a better idea of these distances, I'll again use an example where the fire is beginning at this red ignition point, and by adding together each of these green distance points, I know the fire spread for 12 minutes by the time the fire department got there. If this fire spread at that average rate of roughly 2 square feet per minute for vacant lots, then I know that this fire engulfed an area of 25 square feet by the time the fire department got there. Which leads into my response time results. So the Brushfire tool incorporates a Network Analyst extension of ArcGIS, and specifically the closest facilities option, which measures the cost of traveling from an origin to a destination. Here I've selected the 5 nearest fire stations to the brush fire. The fire stations are these blue circles. Their routes to the fire are shown in these light blue lines, and this red square indicates the location of the brush fire. When I ran all 300 scenarios and I looked at the travel times from each station to the brush fire, I found on average it takes roughly 6.5 minutes to get from the station to a fire. In conclusion, the purpose of this project was to create a means of allowing the user the opportunity to prepare and analyze, model, and plan for brush fires in the wild and urban interface. This tool does precisely that by giving them the opportunity to choose a location, generate a rate of spread, and then produce outputs to examine what areas are likely to be burned before the fire department can get there. When I ran 300 brush fire scenarios, I found that on average 1.85 square feet was burned per minute in vacant lots versus 0.05 square feet per minute in washes. I also found that it takes roughly 6.5 minutes for firefighters to get from a fire station to a brush fire. This result was verified by Tucson Fire Department's Deputy Chief Chris Anderson, who estimated that it can take anywhere from 6 to 9 minutes to get from a station to a fire. At this point in time, this tool offers a very general interpretation of brush fires, but there's many avenues to be explored to improve the accuracy of this tool. One such example would be to take the fire spread outputs created from this tool and compare those to ones of an actual brush fire that occurred in Tucson. To do this comparison, we need information on the total area that's burned by that brush fire, which is information the fire department currently doesn't record. However, if that information becomes available in the future, that's certainly one path to explore to improve this tool. Thank you.